Good day, folks. Welcome everybody to Fireworks. My name is Sarush Gul, CEO of Eventcombo. I have with me today Dr. Lisa Sun, who is the professor of psychology at Barnard College at Columbia University. And it's such a pleasure, Dr. Sun, to have you. First of all, how's your day going? You're in a wonderful setting. I'm kind of envious of you compared to my setting. Where are you right now?
I'm in my home in New Jersey. And it's actually, the reason I'm outside is because it's a regular day and the rest of my family is all on meetings, right? The kids are having school lessons and my husband's also working and having his meetings. So it's much actually quieter out here.
No, it's perfect. As a matter of fact, I just had some landscapers outside. It was pretty noisy. And I was, biting my nails, hoping that they would be done, and it worked out fine. So this is the new normal, as they say, Dr. Sun, is, we're meeting virtually and we're recording, and we have to adapt to our new environment, basically. As we progress with our series, Life After the Jab, where we're discussing life during and after the vaccination of our society, specifically here in the U.S., I wanted to, dig in on many areas with you. But before doing that, I wanted to learn a little bit more about yourself. What made you get into psychology?
Honestly, I've known that I wanted to do psychology since middle school.
Wow.
And I think in elementary school, when I was really young, I became very aware really early on that I was different. I was part of a minority group. And I think that Asianness, right, the Asian American me, I was born and raised here, but I knew that the town in which I lived was, I was a little bit different. So I stood out. And I also understood that, the friends I had in school and the teachers had very different culture and different way of speaking and different interests than what my parents looked like at home. And so I saw, oh, wow, there's very different cultures, and I'm kind of stuck in middle of it. So very early on, I was so interested in just people and how people think, what people think of each other. And that I learned later in middle school, that, that's something known as psychology. And I kind of very consciously made a decision then, oh, that's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm interested in. It's what keeps me awake, gets me awake up in the morning every day, that I want to know about people and also myself. So I decided very early on. So first day of college, I said, yeah, I'm going to be a psych major. There was no question.
Wow. Pretty interesting. You brought up a couple of things I can relate. You were born here. I'm the son of immigrants, as you're the daughter of immigrants, I'm assuming.
Yes.
And that dynamic is pretty interesting, where you adapt to the U.S. and the culture here, and then at home you have somewhat of a different culture. I'm really curious about that. I think we can do a whole separate show on that. So as you always had the passion, as you said, you recognized this passion in middle school. Take us through a little bit of the journey into how you progressed into, the Fulbright Scholarship program.
When I was young, I became pretty aware that even if I'm the daughter of immigrants, like other children of immigrants, all of us, right? Each of us were very different in how we approached kind of assimilating into America. And for me, because we're all so different, for me, it was very obvious that I did not want to lose my Koreanness. I wanted to know how to speak Korean. When I was young, I was kind of upset and kind of, wanted to know more about Korean history, for example, or Asian history, which we didn't learn in school. And because of that, there was, actually one incident where I was attending Saturday morning Korean schools, like a lot of other immigrant children. They would go to Saturday language schools for their ancestors' language. And we actually had a history class and this was when I was in third grade.
Okay.
And I was so excited to learn about Korean history. But I realized then that all of the other Korean Americans in the class were not excited. They were not excited. They thought this was dumb and annoying, and they didn't want to attend classes on Saturdays.
Mm-hmm.
And I understood that. I mean, I, of course, would rather just play on Saturdays, but
Of course.
I'm so interested. And there was something about, wanting to understand, where my parents came from, where they grew up. And it was kind of like a missing piece for me. And so as when I went to college, I had opportunities to go to Korea. And so when I had those opportunities, for example, summer breaks, I went, and I actually didn't go until, my right before my senior year. And then after I graduated, and then since then I started going every single year during the summer breaks.
Nice.
But, these were just short glimpses.
Mm-hmm.
But I still had that yearning. And so my very first year-long sabbatical that I had as a professor, I already knew, wow, I'm going to try to get some kind of research experience, working experience, get into the community in Korea, and to go. And I was so fortunate to get this Fulbright. So I went 2013-14, and then I loved it so much that I went again in 2018-19. And the Fulbright experiences for me were, the most valuable experiences that I'd had in my life as a Korean American.
Wow.
Right? It just kind of filled in the missing pieces that I thought I had growing up all my life.
You've been published in Psychological Science, Cognitive Science, the Educational Psychology Review. I wanted to ask you some specific questions on exactly what's happening today. Do you also practice psychology, like with patients, or are you just on the academic side?
Yeah, I'm just on the academic side, and I'm in cognitive psychology, which is very different from clinical psychology, even though they're related in that we care about people. And so my little kind of subfield is really on learning and learning strategies and biases that people have. And, it's interesting because not only just this past year, but, kind of continuously on and off. As a professor, you also advise, you're a mentor to students. So I actually, that I take it very seriously, that aspect of my position at Barnard. I really, care about the students. And before the academic learning, I definitely want to make sure that they are kind of, mentally, stable, happy. They're they know what they're curious about. They want to learn about how to learn. And so that's really kind of the connection to metacognition, right? I want them to know and be certain of their self-identity and be able to follow that kind of honestly, right? And not kind of, be dissuaded for doing things that they want to do.
Sure. No, makes sense. And you did author a book called Metacognition.
In Korean.
In Korean. So that book was published in South Korea. And is it available in English here in the US or not yet?
No, it's really quite different because it was from the point of view of thinking about the Korean individual in Korea.
Got it.
And so it's a little bit different, but it does, include a lot of research on metacognition, including my own. So it's really kind of a mixture of kind of, pop psychology plus the actual research plus my own experiences as an Asian person in America and as a mother. Right. It's really about, teaching our children to become metacognitive.
Sure. So take us through what metacognition is, Doctor.
Verbally, it sounds very simple. Researchers call it cognition about cognition, right? It's our ability to think about our thinking. Okay. But, it's a lot more complicated to put it into practice. So, for example, most of the literature is all about metacognitive breakdowns and illusions. So to give an example, one of the most common types of metacognitive breakdown is overconfidence, right? A student who's learning might think that, they're done thinking. I'm done with my studying. for my test tomorrow. But then the next day when they take the test, it ends up that they were wrong, right? They at the time, they thought I knew it all.
Sounds like me, Dr. Sun, yeah.
Sounds like all of us, right?
Yeah.
And so metacognition is basically, it's a process that has two components. One is known as the monitoring component, where you judge your ongoing learning as you study. And then there's the control process, which is based on the monitor. So if you say, well, this is really easy, I know it all, then the control aspect says, I can finish studying now. Right. And so there are these two parts. And if either of the two kind of goes awry, you're not going to have very good learning.
Interesting.
Right.
Interesting. Well, it's a very, very interesting topic. And I do have a lot of questions for you on it. For the sake of time, Dr. Sun, wanted to see how you apply, metacognition theory in some of the topics that our society is currently, confronting, right? Getting into COVID and the era that we're in now, something that's extremely sensitive. Recently in the news, you must be seeing a lot of anti-Asian sentiment, and there's a lot of root causes for that. But if you can kind of speak to, Dr. Sun, the effect, both short-term and long-term, that bias and anti-Asian sentiment has as it relates to COVID, or even obviously outside of COVID, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on the impact on the Asian community.
It's very difficult. I think that, this whole past year, Asian Americans have been affected in really two ways, kind of doubly affected. And the first has been related to COVID-19, right? Just like everyone, we're worried about our health, our loved ones, right? We're wearing masks, we're socially distancing, we're not being as social as we want to be, we're getting vaccinated, we're doing everything, right, that the guidelines say we should do, just like all Americans. But there's this second way that you bring up, and it actually has nothing to do with the virus. Instead, it has everything to do with stress, stereotyping, and hate. And that is the racism that we've seen. And I think, yes, I have seen all of this in the media. It's been horrifying. And, it's kind of the invisible hate that I've always felt has become more visible. So I would not say that it's new, actually. I do think that what is new is that you're seeing a lot more targeted hate and violence towards the more vulnerable. For example, Asian and Asian American women, and also the elderly. So it's been really doubly terrible. I've thought a lot about why this is happening, and people have asked me, why is this happening? And I don't know the answer, and I don't know if there's only one answer. But one thing that I do think is that we're all stressed. Right, we really are suffering, and we need to find someone to blame, and we need a scapegoat. And it happens to be that I think that Asian Americans became that scapegoat. And like I said, it's not due to COVID. It's due to stereotyping, right? We're not willing to see the individual. And I think that a lot of us, when we're stressed, we kind of reflectively stereotype, and some people, when they see anyone who looks like they overlap with the category of Asianness, however that's defined, the stereotypes will come out like, oh, Asians are smart, Asians are quiet, or even worse, Asians are foreign, or Asians carry diseases. So the thing that I've thought about a lot is that I want people to know that whether a stereotype seems positive or negative, a stereotype is a stereotype. And it means that the individual, right, the individual's unique characteristics is ignored. And that's where you see this kind of borderline stereotype becoming a racist act. Right. I've talked often about this one seemingly positive stereotype of Asian Americans, which is the model minority.
Right.
And, it's really terrible because it basically means that we are a group who behaves. Right. And it's very harmful because it means that, we should be just grateful for being here, that we shouldn't complain. It also means that if we're attacked, we shouldn't fight back or protest, right? We have to kind of stay within the boundaries of this really terrible stereotype. And, and because of this pandemic, I don't want to stereotype either. So I can't speak for all Asian Americans, but for me, this past year has been so difficult because I have seen all the hate and violence and want to do something about it, but to some degree, I need to make a decision. And that decision is sort of like, do I continue to play this model minority so that I can continue to be accepted as an American? Or do I protest and speak out, but at the same time risk showing myself as, here I am, an Asian minority individual? And if I do that, it's very stressful, and people might think, well, of course you should protest. These are terrible acts that are going on, but you have to imagine, getting statements thrown at you like, well, if you don't like it here, go back where you belong, right? Or if it weren't for you, we wouldn't have this virus. These statements are very stressful, and they're gonna be, kind of have an impact for a very long time. And so I think in general, people have to understand that, we are not necessarily vulnerable, right, or weak, but there's a cost to kind of complaining or protesting or fighting back. And I think it's kind of a circular problem. Right? When you're nervous that, oh, now I'm going to really stand out as an Asian. And that's why it's been really difficult.
Yeah, no, and Dr. Sen, as you were speaking, I couldn't help but recollect memories of growing up. You're 100% right. It's always been there. Even as I was growing up, I used to be called Gandhi, not in a nice way. It was meant in a derogatory way for whatever reason. And we, as a family, we always kept it quiet. I never wanted to, complain about it or raise a voice about it. And everything you said is so true. It's interesting, the dynamic here, the immigrant dynamic, the race dynamic, in the U.S., the COVID aspect, and everything you said is true. In fact, it's always been there, and now it's kind of bubbling up. Our brothers and sisters in the African American community, in the Latino community. Everyone has gone through this and is going through this, and probably will, unfortunately, always go through this. But as the Asian community, I couldn't agree with you more. It is a balancing act. I find myself doing exactly what you said, where, do we speak up or do we remain as that, model minority, where we're polite and we're very, quiet. Maybe that sentiment needs to be challenged, and voices like yours are really important during this time, because this is the discourse that needs to happen, right? And I appreciate you calling that out. That leads me to my next question, Dr. Sun. Once vaccinations are rolled out, they're happening pretty aggressively in the U.S. But once it reaches a certain number, once hopefully COVID starts, disappearing, racism is never going to go away, whether it's against our Black community, our Hispanic community, or our Asian American community and other minority communities. But do you think this anti-Asian, experience that we're having right now, do you think it's going to decrease, or do you think it's going to spike even further?
I was kind of thinking, going back and forth with how to answer this type of question. And I've, people have asked me this before, but I do think that it will, as COVID kind of subsides and people get vaccinated, I think people will start feeling safer and protected, and that means not as stressed. So as the stress sort of abates, then, the kind of scapegoating and stereotyping, I think, might also subside somewhat. But right now, it's hard to have 100% hope in that, because we do see a lot of, things, people getting vaccinated, things getting better, but the attacks towards Asians have not really subsided.
Right.
We still see things every day. So I think
it's gotten worse.
It's gotten worse. And I also worry that, even if the pandemic ends completely, life is stressful. There are a lot of things that make us stressed. And no matter what, when we're stressed, we're going to start to stereotype. We just don't have the capacity to do that. I want to get to know the individual process at all. But, like you said, on the optimistic side, there have been more Asian Americans and more every American, right, who have been willing to listen, to protest, to bring awareness to the reality that this racism exists, right? Even after the Asian women were murdered in Atlanta, there's still people saying that it has nothing to do with race.
Right.
But I think that, now, given there's an increase in courage, and I do call it courage because of the risks that are involved, but given the courage of activists coming forward, I think people are starting to understand that these crimes do have to do with race, and sometimes race and gender. So I think given these discussions, communications, even our conversation now, I think that we are starting to see that Asian Americans have been stereotyped and are still stereotyped. But now we know that even positive types of stereotypes are very harmful, right? So I think that it will get better in terms of our awareness of what's going on and how different we are, right?
Sure, absolutely. On that same token, what are some things that Asian Americans and non-Asian Americans can do to kind of combat this?
First of all, I think this is about combating racism, period, right? Not only about Asian Americans. And I think, this is such an important question because combating racism will mean very different levels of risk for different individuals and groups. I think, like I said before, Asian Americans are so very different, and we're all trying to assimilate it at different stages, right? I'm kind of over that because I was born and raised here, but there are recent immigrants who are still trying to assimilate and trying to stay quiet and play the model minority for acceptance. And, I think the kind of very scary thing is to have to speak out, especially if it means your foreignness will be highlighted. Right. So for instance, if you think about an elderly Asian person and they are appalled and they want to act and protest, but by doing so, they're showing everyone that, my English is not native. My English is not perfect. It has heavily accented kind of phrases. Right. And that's a risk. People will say, well, then get out of this country.
Right.
And, so the risk of this, I think, is that we're risking looking like perpetual foreigners. And so I think, just over the past few weeks, what I've thought a lot about is what the psychology of activism is. Right? What are the different forms of activism? And I think that this is something that we need to kind of broaden our definition of. We think that it's all about, public rallies and marches and speeches that, on the microphone. And it is even for me, it's a very scary thing. And I'm, the most American Asian you could find. But, to kind of be aware that there are risks, and to allow people to protest in their own safe ways. So it might be something like, anonymous donations, kind of silently typed letters, speeches in their own native language with translators available, right? And to show people that just because you're not crying out loud, it doesn't mean that you don't care. And I think that's been a problem with, a lot of Asian Americans have been kind of accused of not caring enough about racism, not only against ourselves, but of other groups.
Absolutely.
It's kind of like, well, people have said to me, well, have you been there for Black Lives Matter?
Right.
Have you been there for other, and I, thinking back over, especially these past 4 years,
Mm-hmm.
I was at all the women's marches. I was at all the science marches. I was at Black Lives Matter marches, but there is a sense that when I was there, I was also pretty quiet.
Right.
I also marched alone. I wasn't with a large group of my family and friends and Asian people, right?
Okay.
So there's a kind of, I think it's a mistaken sense that we don't care. Right. I think we're just trying to again balance our risks.
Yep.
But we do care very deeply about all forms of hate and protesting. So I think that's what we need to do, understand that there are different levels of activism.
Absolutely. I think my takeaway from what you said, Dr. Sun, is, and I'm speaking about myself here, is we can't be passive anymore, right? I think that's the bottom line, is that, as you just mentioned, when other communities are being impacted, just as a human species, and I'm wondering how metacognition plays into this also, but just as a human species, we, if someone else is injured or someone else is hurt, it's not us. And so, I think we need to get rid of that mentality and, develop a stronger bond with everyone around us. Whether we're the ones that are in pain or if they're the ones in pain, we should still feel the pain and support them. So I think we're all guilty of that as humans. But I totally agree with that. Dr. Sun, to segue, into the event domain, one topic that always comes up, there's a whole community of people that are anti-maskers, right? What do you think is behind that? Obviously, there's conspiracy theorists, and there's a lot of weird stuff that's happening in the country at so many levels, unfortunately. But specifically, I wanted to get your thought on this sentiment that people have about not wearing a masks. Where do you think that comes from? And, where do you think it's going?
It's very puzzling to me. And this might be the very Asian side of me. I go to Korea every summer, every year, like I said before. And way before COVID, people were wearing masks in Korea. We wore masks all the time, and we did it to protect ourselves, and we did it to protect others. Or if we were feeling a little under the weather, it was really common. And, it's kind of like it's your choice. Right. And so for me, I'm puzzled because if one person feels cold and puts on a jacket, it's kind of absurd to think that someone else who doesn't feel as cold would mock that person wearing a jacket. Right. It's, for me, it's a very different, very puzzling moment. But I do think it has to do with who was wearing masks first, during the COVID, early phase of the COVID pandemic in America. And, in January, February of 2020, I was still working, still out and about, going to the grocery store, but I was already wearing a mask. And it was totally obvious that I was the only one.
Right.
And I'm also Asian, right? And because I'm used to it. And I knew that it would be protective to some degree, at least. I knew people were looking at me and staring at me. And I thought, that I was losing some courage because I thought that, wow, what are these people thinking? They're going to think, oh, my gosh, look at that Asian person.
Right.
And, maybe she has a disease, and maybe it's the COVID disease. And this actually affected me so much that, it happened enough that I stopped going out, right? I stopped going to the grocery store for over a year until I was vaccinated. And even then with a mask. So when I think about the reluctance of some Americans to wear a mask, I imagine that they've already learned that, people who wear a mask are Asians, or are an other, right? And there's a stigma became associated with the actual group of people, that stereotype, right? And I think that some people don't want to wear a mask or are reluctant or embarrassed because it might make them look more foreign, And it might kind of take away their sense of belonging into whatever group they felt they belonged before in America.
Interesting.
And so it's puzzling and interesting, but I think, and this is just my own interpretation, but I think that the mask has come to represent a very different symbol to different groups, right? If I were to make a sweeping claim, it's for Asians, a mask meant, safety and anonymity.
Of course.
But during the pandemic, it actually came to mean, stand out foreignness.
Right.
And as a result, I think for other Americans and even some Asian Americans, the mask has become, come to symbolize definitely foreignness. And that, again, now there's the risk, right? And so you kind of want to have your allies. And if so many people are saying, no, I don't want to wear the mask, then you're careful and you decide and you feel threatened by other people who might be wearing a mask.
Right. No,
so I think it's a really difficult issue, and I don't, everyone feels different about it, but I hope that, as long as the pandemic is still going on, it is, right? And, a lot of people aren't vaccinated, including our entire population of children and younger teens, that the mask is one way to continue to feel protected for a lot of people. And some people feel that way, especially even Asians, right? Because it's something we're used to anyway, right? That we shouldn't feel pressure to take it off. I certainly, I felt that discomfort, but no longer, right? I will always be wearing a mask, and as long as my kids are not yet vaccinated.
Sure.
And I think that on the flip side, if people feel so threatened by others who continue to mask up, I'm not, first of all, I don't know what to say to those people, except that I hope that, you realize there is no threat, right? There's not a threat. These people just want to err on the safe side, right?
Exactly.
So that's the only thing I could say.
Yeah, no, it all makes sense. I think one thing that you pointed out, which resonates with my thinking, at least, is different groups have made it their own issue. Right? Some have, it's been a justification for preconceived beliefs, to call out their preconceived beliefs, and it's an interesting dynamic. Again, I think the next topic, Dr. Sun, learning and metacognition. I wanted to specifically ask you, with the advent of virtual events now, with connecting virtually the way me and you are right now, what are some of the challenges specifically around learning and metacognition that one would encounter learning virtually, connecting virtually, engaging virtually? How does metacognition play into that? I guess for the good and maybe for the bad. Would love to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, even without a pandemic, good metacognition is difficult. And this is because I think metacognition, it can also be thought of as a process that's very individual and personal. It's very private, right? It's our own thoughts and judgments about our own thoughts, right? And we each learn at different rates. We have different interests. We have different attentions, right? And so, when we teach in the classroom, even if it's 10 students, right, it's impossible to know every student's metacognitive process, right? And to appropriately teach to that student's level. So fortunately, in the metacognitive literature, we know that there are different ways we can encourage students to practice their own metacognition in class and outside of class. So for instance, we might incorporate small ungraded quizzes, right, at the beginning of each class. This might remind students that that they might forget, or that they should study in more beneficial ways. They should test themselves, these kinds of strategies. But over the past year on Zoom and during a pandemic, even these simple strategies are really not easy because,
Sure.
we know everybody is stressed. There are people, I've had more than several students who were sick with COVID. I've had many people who knew of loved ones who were suffering from COVID. And, the social connections are not there. People are feeling very distanced and, some very alone. And, the last thing I want to do is give frequent quizzes, right? Even if they're ungraded, I wouldn't want to do that. So in some sense, it's been much more difficult to know what my students are thinking and how their learning is going. The other thing that makes it difficult is I don't force my students to put their video on. Because that even if they're all on, if I have more than a certain number of students, I can't even see them all, right? They're tiny. And then some students might be in a public space, they're masked, right? And so it's very difficult to get access to this metacognition of each individual. Right. So the thing that I've done is I've definitely slowed down my classes. But also try to go more deeply and personally into content. I have been more open about things that I'm dealing with. I've talked about my Asian American kind of issues. And some of my Asian American students have been really grateful for that because they're going through similar issues. And, I think that this is the thing that's been, really difficult, but there's ways to do it. It's all about connecting with the individual. One thing that I did this past semester is for one of their papers, I had them write whatever they wanted on the topic of metacognition that we were learning about. And it was really great. I got no complaints of students not wanting to do the task or struggling through it. And in fact, it was sort of like a catharsis or like a release of stress. Like they really opened up, and I so enjoyed reading them, and I got to know each of my students so well. And I also kind of on the learning side of it, I kind of felt better that wow, they are learning, they are writing, they are contributing. And one of the things that's really interesting. I read a paper and about, I can't remember the authors. I had it written down somewhere, I thought, but it was a paper that was about who keeps their audio off and why. I mean, their video off and why.
Interesting.
And it was published in January of this year. But what they found was that underrepresented minorities, when compared to non-underrepresented minorities, they gave reasons that were very different. And most of the reasons had to do with, I don't want to show people what's in the background, or I don't, the Wi-Fi might go in and out. The Wi-Fi, I can't depend on it. So you even see that in, this paper was great to me because it's very insightful. It suggested that, don't force students to turn their video on because it's going to affect different groups in different ways, right?
Unintended consequences there, and really powerful ones. Who would have thought? I'm not sure if it was the same piece, but I did come across some information along those lines where, certain vulnerable communities, academic presence virtually was significantly lowered or decreased because of these reasons. And it's just shocking. It's just so sad, right? So that's there. So,
I found the authors.
Oh, you did? Yeah.
Castelli and Sarvari. January.
Castelli and Sarvari. Got it. Thanks for that, Dr. Sun. Thanks for that reference. I will check that out. Dr. Sun, a couple of more points. Again, I think we have to have another session. I can speak to you for hours. So many wonderful areas of discussion. There has been value in connecting virtually. And based on what you said, I think it requires an analysis of, the vulnerabilities that some, students or attendees are challenged with, and then on the other side, bringing the outcome-oriented approach and bridging that gap together, right? So I'm going to go out on a limb and say you do see the value in virtual, yes or no?
I actually do. And I do think I'm in the minority though. And I think there were two kind of things of value that resulted from this year-long experiment of being online. And, for me, I've seen a different type of student open up in ways that you can only find during online.
Interesting.
And, what I mean is, I think in my classes, we've run into problems where you have the same few outspoken students constantly participate, and then some of the quieter ones are just very quiet.
Right.
And of course, active discussion is another metacognitive strategy.
Right.
We want people to participate, but if you're shyer, or if you think your English is not good enough, or you're slower, or whatever it is, right? The Zoom classes to me have been really beneficial for that type of student, because they could use the chat function. They don't have to have the video on, like I said before, but they could still have their voice heard. It kind of lessens the spotlight.
Right.
And we could do this because it was online. Yeah. And so I've seen a difference in that on Zoom, I've had more number of students talk or chat than the students. Sometimes I have to kind of nudge them more in the classroom sometimes. And I guess the other benefit that I've sort of seen is that I've been able to connect more globally, right? Because students and colleagues, we're all stuck in different locations. We've been forced to think about time zones to make sure that we're providing equal education for all of our students, no matter where in the world. And I think that's been so important, thinking about ways in which to increase our awareness of who our students are, each of them, and where they come from. And for me, again, being Asian, it's been especially good for me to connect with students in Asia who are still abroad, and making sure that they feel that they're not being left out or missing out, right? And I think that as teachers, we always want our students to feel like they are part of the group, they're part of the class and the discussion. And in some strange way, the online learning has allowed for me to do that and to think in that way.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. I think the individuality aspect of it has risen to the top. Really powerful thought there. I think also the removal of geographic boundaries, right? I think that also has been very powerful. These are some positive outcomes from virtual, no doubt, and I think you've kind of just validated those, Dr. Sun. Dr. Sun, this has been such a great conversation. You've made my week brighter, just in having been exposed to your thought process and how you're contributing to your students and honestly to the society around us. So really, I'm grateful to you for the time you spent with us today. We'll stay in touch with you, Dr. Sun. Are there any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
I guess that, I'm very happy to talk to you and to also continue to think about these issues, because I think it's going to be an ongoing conversation, right? Even after the pandemic, even after we're in class or at meetings in person. I do think, like, you said, that these kinds of virtual events will continue kind of simultaneously. And I hope they do, because I actually love sometimes just, getting up in the morning and, eating breakfast and then just coming, right to the computer rather than having to get a flight and a hotel and, do all these things. So there's been, kind of the optimistic side, I hope, of what comes out of this.
No doubt. That resonates really strongly, Dr. Sun. Dr. Sun, such a pleasure. I hope you go into that background of yours and enjoy the rest of your day. And looking forward to reconnecting with you at some point. Thank you so much.
Thank you.